Welcome to Podkey Daily News, where today the biggest risks are legal, military, cyber, and economic. A U.S. jobs miss moved markets. Iran-linked hackers exposed a weak point in basic infrastructure, and new warnings around Russia are getting harder for NATO to shrug off. The most practical domestic risk in this brief is water. Iran-linked hackers reportedly targeted drinking water and wastewater systems across at least a dozen states and more than 100 municipalities during the U.S.-Iran conflict. In some cases, this went beyond nuisance access. Officials say attackers manipulated control systems, suppressed alarms, and caused shutdowns, flooding, and pressure loss. Why that matters is simple. If someone can quietly change pressure or chemical levels in a water system, this stops being an IT problem and becomes a direct public health problem. The exposure is broad because the U.S. has roughly 150,000 public water systems, many small, underfunded, lightly staffed, and running old equipment with remote access turned on for convenience. What to watch next is whether Washington can actually rebuild cyber capacity. Federal standards have repeatedly stalled. EPA efforts ran into resistance, and CISA has been weakened by staff cuts, funding strain, politicization, and leadership gaps. U.S. intelligence now judges Putin could test NATO with a limited assault on an allied country within the next few years. A full invasion is still seen as unlikely, but the risk is rising. That warning lands at the same time Western deterrence looks thinner. Officials say U.S. stocks of long-range weapons and air defense interceptors, especially Patriots, have been depleted by support for Ukraine and operations in the Middle East. Inside occupied Ukraine, a BBC investigation found Russian authorities have declared more than 34,000 homes ownerless to process seizures and transfer property to Russian passport holders. Experts describe that as part of a wider Russification effort. Europe is also tightening pressure at sea. A Swedish court approved handing a seized cargo ship to Ukraine for a war crimes probe tied to allegedly stolen grain from occupied Crimea, spotlighting Russia's shadow fleet and how hard it still is to police. The near-term watch point is whether allies replenish munitions fast enough to make deterrence credible, because the strategic warning is getting sharper while inventories are not. The Middle East picture is still unstable in ways that connect directly back to those weapons shortages. Talks over reopening the Strait of Hormuz reportedly center on an Iran-Oman draft that would bar American and Israeli vessels, fine violators, and leave Iran in charge of navigation and monitoring. Washington sees that as ceding too much control, and the proposal is tied to a U.S. move to end its blockade of Iranian ports, so this is nowhere near settled. At the same time, diplomacy around Gaza remains fragile. Public claims of a deal ran ahead of actual agreement, and the core trust gap remains the same. Israel doubts Hamas will disarm, and Hamas doubts Israel will fully withdraw. Add in Houthi attacks hitting Saudi-linked targets and injuring civilians, and Gulf states have even more reason to push for de-escalation while also worrying about U.S. defense capacity. On the economy, July payrolls came in much weaker than expected. The U.S. shed 23,000 jobs when economists had expected an 83,000 gain, and earlier months were revised down. The losses were concentrated in government, leisure and hospitality, and retail. Construction tied to AI infrastructure still added jobs, and healthcare remained positive but slower. The practical read is that the labor market now looks more sideways than resilient, with a higher chance of further slowing. Markets took that as reducing the odds of a September Fed rate increase. Stocks rose, the S&P 500 hit a record, the Nasdaq jumped, and Treasury yields eased. What matters next is that the Fed still gets more jobs and inflation data before deciding, so this report moved expectations but did not settle policy. Two Trump legal fights are worth tracking because both test how far executive power can reach without Congress or a constitutional change. First, the administration issued new orders narrowing the earlier birthright citizenship push. The targets are children of foreign terrorist group members or foreign government employees, along with visa denials for suspected birth tourism. Courts are likely to scrutinize that closely because the Supreme Court recently reaffirmed broad 14th Amendment protections, and judges may see this as an effort to reach a similar result through immigration enforcement instead. Second, a federal appeals court ruled Trump cannot unilaterally demolish or dramatically alter the White House, pausing above-ground construction of the proposed $400 million ballroom and saying Congress must approve major changes. Trump is still appealing, and reported bunker work below ground may continue. The other issue here is money. Large private donations have reportedly been raised for the project without full disclosure. A New Mexico judge ordered Meta to pay more than $900 million and adopt safeguards aimed at reducing harm to young users, including hiding like and photo counts by default and improving disclosure of platform risks. Meta plans to appeal, but this matters well beyond one state. It is one of thousands of cases against the company, and other multi-state actions are seeking far larger damages. So the thing to watch is whether this ruling becomes a template for courts and regulators trying to force platform design changes through liability, not just fines. In Colombia, Abelardo de la Espriella, a previously little-known lawyer backed by Trump-style rhetoric and endorsed by Donald Trump, was sworn in as president promising order, authority, and aggressive action against cartels. He has proposed hardline military measures, including bombing trafficking camps and vessels. Supporters will read that as a break from drift. Critics argue Colombia's crisis is rooted in deeper structural issues that military force alone will not solve. In Spain's North African enclave of Ceuta, authorities say more than 1,200 unaccompanied children have arrived in a sudden migration surge. The urgent issue there is basic protection, identification, shelter, protection from violence, and deciding quickly whether reunification or transfer to mainland Spain is in each child's best interest. The FAA ordered inspections of 471 Boeing 737 MAX jets after cracks were found around a door area. This was described as precautionary rather than an urgent grounding, but it adds to scrutiny around fleet safety. Airbnb raised its full-year revenue outlook as bookings improved in several major markets, and the company says it wants to become AI native by using AI across support, discovery, and host tools. That is a strategy shift worth watching because it treats AI as a redesign of the business, not a feature add-on. And in Congo, Ebola cases have passed 4,000 with nearly 2,000 deaths. Health authorities are leaning harder on village-centered response, free local care, and trusted community elders because distrust and delayed treatment have been driving spread. That's the brief for now. Thanks for listening to Podkey Daily News. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.